Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to put accents into your writing for better characterization. The idea here is that we're actually going to be altering some of the words that we use for dialogue to help indicate that this person that we're talking about is talking from a regional perspective. This adds a little bit of flavor to our characters. Sort of like if you add different types of spices to a dish, you can actually change the flavoring and how it's actually perceived. A couple cautions and notes when we're talking about characterization in this way. While this is a very in-your-face type of situation, this is something that you cannot only rely on for your characterization. If you do, you're going to have a very flat character, even though that there's going to be a veneer or a wallpaper of what the character looks like. There's going to be no depth beyond it. So when we're talking about writing our characters, this is only a small portion of what we're talking about when we want to be creating our characters. We cannot just rely on just words that we use to help give a flavor, but rather we need to make sure that there's substance to our characters and not something that we are just relying for an easy change in our story. Just as a heads up, what I did is I actually took some of the passages we looked at last week with Romeo and Juliet and put it into a AI where I was actually able to ask it to create different dialects based off of that work or those notes. So we're going to go over and we're actually going to be taking a look at a handful of different regional accents that we can actually use to help give flavoring to our characters. Another caution is that we don't want to overuse these. What can end up happening is if we go too far into creating these accents, it actually makes it a little bit more difficult for our readers to read. Now, this is only going to be a huge factor early on as you are introducing the characters, but what can end up happening is it could be a turnoff for readers. I have seen where at the start, the character's accent was very heavy, and while it didn't change throughout the story, I was able to understand and grow to read the character the way that it was meant to be written. There is a drawback to this. Like I said, you want to make sure that you are, when you're introducing these characters, you don't want to make it too burdensome for our readers. Alright, so let's get into it. First passage. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. This is what I'm planning on doing is actually starting with the original, so we have a gauge from which we go from and we can point out to see how things have changed. We'll start with the original and then we'll go through different ones. All right, the first one is going to be a southern accent. Well now, what's light shining through that there window? Why, it's the east and Juliet's the sun. Here, we can tell very easily that we're talking about when we see here, shining. Leaving off the G is a very southern thing. Well now, that's another term, a word whisper for southerners when we're talking about when we're creating these dialects. Australian. But crocky, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east and Juliet's the sun. Crocky, that is a very regional word here. Australians are the only ones who actually use this word. But we'll go through other ones, and there are other words that we can figure out and replace in the actual piece to actually give a regional flavoring. O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name. Or if thou wilt not, be but sworn my love, and I will no longer be a Capulet. Yo Romeo, Romeo, why use Romeo? Forget your old man and ditch your name. Or if you can't do that, just swear your love by me, and I ain't going to be a Capulet no more. This is something else that we need to make sure that we're paying attention to. Why use is the same thing as saying, wherefore art thou? Why are you? It's that same thing, and we want to make sure that we're being consistent. If I actually took this from what was originally put out by the AI, it actually says, where are you, Romeo? But that's not what the actual meaning was. So this is obviously one of the big downsides of using AI, is that it's not perfect. So when we're understanding what the original intent is, from that we can extrapolate what's the actual trying to say, what do we want our character to say in the regional accent that we are using. In the southern, oh Romeo, Romeo, why y'all gotta be Romeo? Forget about your daddy and drop that name. Or if you won't, just swear your mind and I ain't going to be a Capulet no more. Here, it's a lot more accurate compared to the New York, because why y'all got to be Romeo? That's saying the same thing as what the original said. Australian. Oh, Romeo, Romeo, why you got to be Romeo? Did your dad chuck your name? If you can't do that, just swear by your love for me, and I'll stop being a Capulet. Here, we're seeing why you got to be Romeo. We're using different words in different patterns to indicate where this person's from. That's essentially what this is. And when we're talking about this, we're talking about in a way of doing it so that it is easy to identify for the reader. That's the ultimate goal for all of these, is we got to make sure that this is not something that we are creating just one-off, but rather a pattern. We want to make sure that our character stays the same consistently throughout the story. Now this is not necessarily important for some, like a side character, but we're talking about a recurring character, or even a character that has several scenes, where you want to make sure that you're adding flavoring to the character. These are good ways of doing this. By which we call a rose, by any other name, would smell as sweet. You know, rose, eh? No matter what you call it, it's still going to smell as sweet, eh? Here's another way. Words like a are understood to be a very specific accent, very specific word whisper. Word whispers are one of those things that we can add into our story that give us a more flavoring, sort of like salt or pepper, where as long as you don't overdo it, it can actually increase the flavoring. Here in New York, yo, a rose by any other name? Forget about it. It still smelled just as sweet. Forget about it right here. This is a very, not really a word as we would understand it, but because people are familiar with that word, they are able to associate it with a very specific person and a very specific way of talking. Now, there are going to be overlaps, like this word here, yo. Yo is a very common thing where you can see that pretty much anywhere where you're talking a more urban environment. Yo, short for you. Yo. This is something that we need to make sure that we're not just talking about a very specific area where we're trying to be overbroad with our flavorings, but we can add these to our stories to help us create flavors for our characters. Like a rose by any other name would totally smell just as sweet, you know. Somebody who's more on the West Coast, the LA accent, it's a very distinctive one, and it's pretty easy to actually show in our story. There are going to be some accents that are not going to necessarily translate as well. This is something for you to decide of how much you want to actually input to your story. And we always want to, like I said earlier, we always want to make sure that we're not necessarily doing it in such a way that you are overburdening your reader. You want to make sure that it is a light sprinkling and not necessarily something that's going to cause such a big problem. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. For never there were a tale of more woe, than this of Juliet and her Romeo, you know. This is one of, like I said earlier, is one of those word whispers that we can add into our stories. For never was the story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. Now, something else we can keep in mind is that sometimes when we're talking about words, we're not necessarily adding words here. So for instance, never. This is another way of pronouncing never. But if we change it where it's instead of an ER to an AE, it's a never. That's a more of what we're looking for. We're not necessarily relying on one thing like word whispers, but we can actually change how the words are actually spelled to give us a more dramatic flair. Now, a note, you will be fighting your spell check and your editor sometimes on something like this. It's very easy to get caught up into, well, this is the way we want to make sure is easy for our readers, and computers are not really necessarily good at understanding that you're trying to add a dramatic flair, and depending on your editor, they might not necessarily be up for that. But at the end of the day, it's your story. It is what it's going to be. You just need to make sure that you're doing the things for the right reasons rather than for, laziness or something to that effect. All right, that's all I had for today. I really wasn't looking to do anything crazy long. As always, all the resources I use, I link in the description. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave it in the comments section below. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe. Yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.